After 70 years, that what he goes there for is to unlock the door. Well, those around him criticize and sleep. And through a fractal on a breaking wall, I see you, my friend, and touch your face again. Miracles will happen as we treat. Get a little crazy. No, we're never gonna survive unless we are a little crazy. Yellow people walking through my head. One of them's got a gun to shoot the other one. And yet together they were friends at school.
Bosnians, young and old, will die like this.
There is no water at all. We are out of water medicals.
Well, I'm smart.
Okay, well, there's our video done.
Okay, away we go.
Hello, hello.
What a great name.
What?
Hello everyone, welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming this evening. We've got some seats at the front if you want to come down and be standing. Before I hand over to Vaughan Smith, who is chairing this evening, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Over to Vaughan.
Full house, welcome to the Frontline Club for our Bosnian War event to mark the 20th anniversary of the start of the war. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ed Viliami, who I'm sure many of you know. He's obviously a multiple award-winning journalist, but he's also a good friend and a key supporter of the Frontline Club and has always been very helpful to the club, so we're in his debt. And so I'm very grateful for you coming today. Ed is also one of the leading journalists on Bosnia, who was there early, and he's got an important book out, which you can all buy. I've read it. The War is Dead, Long Live the War. Now, we chose this book and Ed for this event because it's not just about the war, it's about the peace afterwards. And it seems to us that the best way to look at the conflict and its resolution is by appreciating the quality of the peace that has followed it. The Bosnian War has been described by some, many even, as a civil war, but I'm sure that Ed will take issue with that, and I hope he does. But what it certainly was a strikingly brutal war, often fought by neighbours, and people who thought of themselves as friends before it started. It seems to me that has led to great hatreds that certainly haven't been resolved, and I think that Ed's book goes some way to explaining where all that is today. So I'm going to start by asking you, Ed, why did you write this book, and what need do you feel you're addressing with it?
Golly, why indeed? I think, wars, and we talk a lot about wars in this room, come and go, with the sometimes necessary whimsy of the headlines and the television news. But as you implied, this book could have been written about Rwanda, it could have been written about a number of other places, tragically. But for the people whose lives are shattered by them, they don't end when the fighting is over. And for many of them, they never do or never will. And those people tend to get forgotten, especially if they are scattered and shattered, as are the cast of this book, as a result of ethnic cleansing in the war. So the first reason I wanted to write it was basically to sort of register their disappearance, if that's not an oxymoron, just to make sure that that their story is there. And then also I think, this was a war which was fought in Europe at the beginning of what George Herbert Bush called the New World Order. And to quote a friend from another instance of Mexico, it turned out not to be a breakdown of that order, but very much part of it. So it's a story about these characters, but it has riptides, I hope, running through it, although I don't pontificate or philosophize much in it, about the question of, well, you use this word, has not been resolved, about this word, resolution, which I think is a lie.
What do we know about the facts of the war? I mean, 20 years on, what happened? I mean, what do the statistics tell us? What can we be safe on? I mean, today, clearly, the truth is still a contested space. But what do you feel is safe for us to rely on?
Right, well, and that's a very good question. And let's come back to this, because the truth is actually buried in the ground. The truth is body parts. That's where the count is. That's where the that's where the evidence is. But what we can be safe with, and we've got to be careful here, because some people know very little, or maybe sometimes even nothing about this ghastly violence. Others have lived it. Others have suffered from it. Others know all about it. So I've got to cater for people who. I've got to ask those who do know all about it to bear with me. I mean, what I think we can safely say is that across swathes of territory in Bosnia-Herzegovina, according to a plan devised largely in Belgrade, an attempt was made to clear that ground, that terrain, which was claimed as a so-called Greater Serbia, of all non-Serbs. That was the sort of the bottom line, that when Bosnia declared independence from Yugoslavia, a sufficient number of people, most of them Serbs, some Croats, decided, no, we're not part of this country. And okay, well, that's fair enough. I suppose you could say there were political reasons for that, and we may hear them tonight from people who are Bosnian Serb or Bosnian Croat. But there's a jump from that to the eradication through death or deportation with torture and mutilation and beating and rape on the way of all those who were not part of that ethnicity. That was the bottom line, and that, I think, is our starting point.
So was it a genocide?
The Hague, if we follow the strictures of the Hague, the only incident of genocide was committed at Srebrenica, the massacre, 3 long, bloody years into the war after it started, and we can talk about why that happened later. But and I'm going to depend on a lot of judgments at the Hague, so I'm on slightly difficult ground here. Where I come from and where a lot of other people come from, if one ethnicity tries to eradicate and wipe out another one and all memory of it in terms of its religious churches or mosques and its libraries and its history, that's genocide. The Germans have a useful word. Mr. Krauscher will correct me. It's either Volkenmord or Volkermord. The people, death. They should know. And that's quite a useful one, so we'll call it that.
So
I call it genocidal violence, splitting hairs slightly.
So about 100,000 people killed, 2 million
Yeah.
refugees. Are all these safe?
Yeah, I think 100,000 is 100. I think it's 104,000, of whom something like, again, I'm a journalist, I hate numbers, of whom something like 10% are still missing, which is in itself an atrocity and outrage, and a major theme in this lack of reckoning we'll be talking about.
Yes, so you discussed that in your,
dead,
you discussed that in the book.
100,000 dead, most of them Bosnian Muslims, many Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats too,
Most of the Muslims, can you expand that? Because this seems to be quite significant in trying to assess the war in terms of, at the time we all remember being told they're all as bad as each other. It's a civil war, so it seems key to assessing whether those statements are true as to the division of the killed and displaced.
Yeah. Well, those who don't remember being told over and over again they're all as bad as each other, let's just slightly stay with that, because not everybody will remember being told that. The international community, and we'll talk about this in more detail later if anyone wants me to.
I do.
Developed this philosophy which became known as moral equivalence, whereby, as the historian of the very singular British role in this repulsive approach, it calls it the perpetratorless crime. The politicians and diplomats and others in their caste, and I regard them as a caste or a class, used to rabbit on about ancient ethnic hatreds and so on, by way of doing nothing. And if you do nothing in a situation like that, you of course appease and encourage the perpetrator. But we can come back to that.
Yeah, but what are the figures?
The figures. Again, numbers ghastly. If we take a figure of 100,000, the only really sort of forensic breakdown of it all that was done by a couple of Polish forensic anthropologists and academics, and they came up with sort of something like 58% Bosnian Muslims, the other 40% share between Bosnian Serbs, Croats, and a number of others actually. The number of Ukrainians is quite high. But of the 3 constituencies, the Bosnian Muslims were by far the biggest.
Is it
the actual statistics are in the book, and like any.
No, I'm sorry, putting you on the spot on these. I could have warned you we're going to get some figures, and we can look them up. Yeah. They're in the book. But I'm right in saying that the division between Muslim civilians and Serb civilians and Croatian civilians is higher than the division between soldiers or people
absolutely.
fighting.
Yes. Yeah. The Bosnian Muslims account for the majority of the dead, and for the proportions of civilians as opposed to military casualties in their share is higher than the other 2. Yeah.
Okay, so
they're the main victims, basically.
Well, I mean, you see why I think that's key in trying to look back on this.
Establishing it, and thank you for doing it, sort of, as it were, mathematically and forensically, rather than just me yakking on as usual. But that'll be great.
This whole idea of the Civil War, where you'll recall, I'm sure, Marie Colvin's one of her final reports the day before she got killed in Syria, where she references the Srebrenica massacre, compares Syria with it. Do you think that's the right comparison? It seems pertinent today that we've got the sort of 20th anniversary and what's happening in Syria. Are there parallels? And this does hark back perhaps to the Civil War issue.
Yes, I mean, I have to say I don't know enough about Syria, and Marie knew too much about it.
Syria is a civil war.
Yeah.
But was Bosnia a civil war?
I don't like the term because of this ethnic element to it. Also, I mean, just to split hairs, Bosnia was by then an independent country, and the eradication of its Muslim people was conceived first of all in Belgrade, so theoretically a foreign power by then. But no, the term civil war suggests it's sort of fought by agreement, that both sides agree to differ in some way. Herding people into concentration camps, killing them, raping them, torturing them, enforced convoys being deported at gunpoint over the mountains night after night, thousands of elderly women and children. That's not civil war. In fact, I'm not even sure I prefer the term. I like the term war particularly, which implies some sort of battlefield between armies approaching each other. The Bosnian army, such as it was a kind of scratched up militia of guys in trainers dishing out bullets singly, one for one, for about the first year. I mean, it was a partisan army of sort of plumbers, carpenters and school teachers trying to, and failing to defend their villages from a hurricane of violence unleashed by the fourth biggest army in Europe. It became a war, but for the, we're commemorating 20 years from 1992. For the first 6 months to a year of this, I think war is a rather sort of
when were you first there?
Term.
Because you were there pretty early on, weren't you?
Yeah.
Roughly when did you arrive, and what were the first things that you saw, and what were your first impressions of what was happening on?
Well, apart from a very brief visit to Sarajevo in the spring, my first encounter of 1992. Sorry, my first encounter was with the countess of her profession over here, Penny Marshall, when we were it's to cut a long story short, made our way into the concentration camps at Omarska and Trnopolje. We did so on the authority of Radovan Karadzic, indirectly in the direct authority of an outfit called the Crisis Staff in Prijedor, which is a town right up in the northwestern Bosnia, which was running these camps. And in a way, that was my first encounter, and that was the one which propels. I mean, I stayed on for 3 years, on and off, more on than off after that. But that was the moment, the first thing I saw when with the shaven-headed inmates of Omarska coming out of a hangar.
You were also with the refugee column.
The book.
You were also with the refugee column, weren't you?
Well, these narratives entwined, and because we found the camps, we unveiled them, we revealed them. We didn't discover them, of course, because the intelligence, so-called intelligence, vaulting term for these people, and the diplomatic stratum and the International Committee of the Red Cross, they all knew about the camps and they knew what was going on in the camps. But it was all permissible to them. Oh, I don't want to rock the boat, old boy, and all that.
Concentration camp.
And yes, of course, they all knew.
Well,
but hold on,
sorry.
Convoy, because then there was a moment when we were all sitting in Zagreb a couple of weeks later, and Croatia shut the door. They'd had 600,000 deportees, as I prefer to call them, not refugees. And a colleague of mine, Andrej Gustincic, wonderful man from Reuters, said, well, that's the front door shut. Where's the back door? I said, well, where indeed? So only one way to find out, but we better get ethnically cleansed, he said. And we did indeed. We sort of found a convoy, went over the mountains with it, and that sort of artery over the mountains, a terrifying day and night, at gunpoint 4 days before. Actually, 240 of the deportees were lined up on the edge of a ravine and massacred, so we missed that by 72 hours, luckily. And that turned out to be the road that every survivor of this people death.
Where was this? Where was it?
Sorry, this was 1992.
But no, where? Which part of
We're
Bosnia?
going from northwest Bosnia over Mount Vlasic, which is into central Bosnia, where the sort of this tidal wave, this exodus of hundreds of thousands of people was being deported.
Some have criticised you for determining them the camps you saw as concentration camps, but in your book you maintain that it's a fair description. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, thanks, Phil, because actually the day that the story was published and Penny's film went out, which was the night of August the 6th, there was this sort of great cacophony of Auschwitz and Belsen, and the radio was ringing from America, and I sort of heard the Nuremberg rally, and I kind of hung up. I thought this was, no, this isn't helping at all. This is just, this is hindering what we're trying to talk about, not helping them. And I refrained from using the word concentration camp, because I didn't want there to be a direct analogy with Birkenau and Auschwitz and Dachau, because that's not what we were talking about. Also, you know, our glimpse that day on August the 5th was, you know, we saw enough, but it was still little. I mean, the truth of the nightmare and the nuances and the complications hadn't yet surfaced and wouldn't do so for a number of years. But on reflection, I think it is the right term for a number of reasons. Strictly speaking, it's right, because they were locations as devised by the British in South Africa for the concentration of civilian populations, for murder, rape, beating, mutilation, and for deportation. The most controversial usage of the term, I mean, for Omarska, I think it's a no-brainer. Likewise, another one called Keraturn. Ternopolier, there's a lot of brouhaha about whether the term is right, and I think it is right. I mean, the population of that region was being literally concentrated in that camp, where there was a lot of murder and rape and torture, prior to enforced deportation. That's a concentration camp. If it isn't, I'm open to suggestions.
But the material that Penny Marshall and filmed, and that you were there as a couple of other people were, seems to have become a sort of focal point for the great argument about the Bosnian War, and an incredibly important one. And having you here means I want to talk about it a bit more, because the whole living Marxism thing, the whole idea of whether the fence was behind or in front of you, or wherever it was, and where it was tacked onto the front and back, and all of that. Could you talk a little bit about this? Because I'm rather confused, because trying to make sense of where all this came from, and some of the people that were alleging this, you know, they're pretty serious people. Noam Chomsky, you know, it was determined by Prospect magazine in a vote by some of its readers to be the world's greatest intellectual, but he would argue against you, and he was critical of you. So, looking back 20 years now, help us out with this. Explain your side of this.
Well, in singling out Professor Chomsky, you single out, you know, the most intelligent of them by a very, very long way. And yes, of course, he's written some marvelous stuff about Latin America and the United States and power in the world and all sorts of things. What he's doing with this lot, I don't know. He has, on a number of occasions, accused me of fabricating everything I've said and written about the camps since the first article I wrote. He's never actually detailed exactly what it is I've fabricated. And I think it's a very serious allegation he makes. It's actually fairly libelous, because, you know, I'm supposed to be a professional journalist. And I'd love him to come and detail exactly what it is in an article or here.
Shall we invite him?
Let's do. I mean, why not? What a good idea to come and detail exactly what it is that I've fabricated, and he might like to discuss this with some of the survivors and the bereaved from the camps. But academics sitting, you know, doing whatever they do, I shan't use any obscenities, behind computer desks, tend not to want to meet the real people that my book is about. You mentioned Chomsky. Well, there is another lot, and they're not particularly intelligent people. They're just a bunch of windbags, didactic revisionists, and filth, to be honest. And they get good jobs writing columns on the Times, but, you know, when time came for them to try and stand up their revolting argument in the court against ITN, who were the only people who had any guts to actually decide to go to court and establish this truth, they were crushed. They couldn't produce produce a single witness. There's a wonderful witness who we met in Ternopil called Iris Merjanic, who very straightforwardly described what was happening in Ternopil. It was this moment where, do you have any cross-examination? Oh, no, my lord. I mean, it was just pathetic. And they're lice, those people. And they're still around. I got an email only yesterday from some jerk referring me to this article that, the fence. And the fence, well, hey, it's part of a long tradition, isn't it? There's a man called Florisson and a man called Leuchter, and they write about whether the bricks at Auschwitz had the thermal capacity to absorb that level of heat. Well, we all know what they're saying, and we all know what living martyrs are saying. They support Miloševic and Karadzic. They support the eradication of the Bosnian Muslims. The only difference is that they haven't got the nerve to say so. But they do it privately. But
you can't account, and I'm not saying you should be able to. I have a question mark in my head about why they would do this. If you were to look at the parliament, if you were to look at some of the political parties involved, Tudjman's party, if you were to look at Karadzic and his party, they didn't seem very socialist or left-wing to me. They seemed rather right-wing, and so I just don't understand how this all fits together.
Well, it baffles me ideologically, I have to say. I mean, I'm sort of warily of the left, and in some cases of the far left. It was a very strange alliance in terms of British politics, for sure, because on the one hand you had Douglas Hurd, Malcolm Rifkin, Pauline Neville-Jones et al. I think we can say, or at least I will say, if they want to challenge it, they can, appeasing at best, encouraging at worst the genocide, and they're certainly not of the left. As it were, sort of, aligning with the sort of, the salon academics of the sort of, the champagne socialist yakkarati. I think it fits to me because you have a sort of a fetid bourgeois culture in this country that loves any form of contrarianism, and it allies perfectly well with this sort of revolting neo-colonial conservatism that always sides with the bully on the block, because that's stability, old boy, isn't it? So, in a way, they're perfect bed partners.
But still today, you can speak to people who truly believe that both parties were equal, it was a civil war, they were, and that intervention by the West or the UN was either not in our interest, which might be the case, but that somehow we allowed to escape. It wasn't on our conscience because, we weren't really doing anything wrong because they were all as bad as each other. Exactly. Now, I felt, and I wonder what you think about, but I guess you're going to agree with me, that this was, because I remember the frustration that journalists had on this, because it sort of it ran counter to much of the reporting that came out of the bulk of the reporting, I would say. But do you feel that that was a campaign to try to get us not take interest, or what was it? Was it a politically motivated thing, or where did that come from? What did we learn from that?
It's very, very strange, and this is why, by the way, thank you all for coming. I mean, it's amazing that you're here 20 years later to listen to this old ancient mariner. The great poem by Coleridge, for those of you who don't know it, is he pins this wedding guest to the wall, and tales of woe. And I feel very like this fellow. I started to feel sorry for the wedding guest. He just wanted to sort of have a drink, go to a wedding, meet a nice girl. But here I am. Thank you for being the wedding. Because during the war, you'd come back and there'd be a sort of Bosnia solidarity group, and I'd be talking to an audience of 3 while this was going on, as the Bosnian Serb deputy president teased me once, just down the road from Venice, he said, almost boasting that the camps had been up and running for 3 months during that period. So this thing of the distance, I don't know, maybe it was too close. Maybe people didn't want to know because it was just down the road from Venice. But I think, we'll get onto the themes of this later. I think, and of course there was the 3 years and the journalism. I mean, yet another lie was this whole thing of, the media has such a big influence on things. I mean, this was the beginning of the lesson that I hope we'll talk about later in the evening. We found concentration camps. There was the enforced deportation convoys you talked about. There was the mass rape, which we haven't dealt with, a crucial ingredient to the genocide, and the sexualization and the subjugation and abuse and violation of women on a mass organized scale. The shelling of these civilian communities cowering in the cellars of little towns, the names of which were long forgotten if they were ever known. And this went on for 3 years. before we got to Srebrenica. You know, somehow this was okay, while the repulsive political and diplomatic class contrived yet another pointless peace plan, yet another, clasped the hands of the killers for whose capture they later bayed beneath the chandeliers of Paris, Geneva, and Washington. And you know, we were, you know, there were some good people trying to report this story. There were a few chances in Sarajevo having a great time screwing the translators and things for sure as well. But there were some good people too, some really good people, and we know who they are. And a few of them are here now. There's one of Tom is at the back and he's gone. Well, it drove you crazy. I mean, what's wrong with this? What power of the media, if that was your question?
Well, it was very much. Note that
Douglas Hurd, David Owen, Peter Carrington and Malcolm Rifkin, they have names, let's name them. They didn't take much notice.
Well, one observes your microphone's being readjusted.
Thank you.
No one heard any of that. Start from the beginning
Just
again.
as well.
It works out that 100 people were being killed a day throughout the whole war, which is quite a startling fact.
Yeah, that's a good statistic.
But
thank you.
One of the observations I have was...
We'll put it in the paper.
No, I think I stole that from the paper. One of the observations I have was how frustrating it was to see good journalism being somehow fuzzied up. And that seems to have happened even more, doesn't it? The digital age has only made that easier. I mean, PR companies expanded, good ones at a rate of 20%. Journalism shrinks, one expects, one believes. Do you feel that that's a correct observation? Do you feel that the truth has become more of a vital component of warfare somehow?
Yeah, Vaughan jumped this one on me just before we came upstairs, and it's a really good, it's a good notion. I haven't managed to sort of put together a coherent response. There's no question. I mean, truth has always been an early casualty when people start killing each other, which is often, and we'll see more of it in the 21st than in the 20th century, I suspect, which is saying something. But in a way, just looking at the way in which lies have been, postmodern lies have been told by the Labour government in Iraq, by the Conservative government in Bosnia. I mean, it's interesting to see the beginning of, spin is a slightly empty word. I prefer lies, actually. That's what it is. And it's interesting to sort of think of it in those terms. Perhaps we can have this in discussion later, because I hadn't thought of it. I mean, we always think of, institutional lying over war as being something that was sort of concocted by Messrs. Blair, Campbell, Powell et al. But actually going back to it in a way one can see a sort of origin in the way in which what was happening on the ground was contrived by the diplomats and the politicians of the United Nations at their press conference. There was one wonderful Welsh spokesman for the UN who resigned, and I remember having lunch with him in London. He said, so I got so sick of getting up every morning, brushing my teeth, and then lying through them. I thought, well, there's an honest. And there weren't many. The 4 Americans resigned, estimably, against their government's culpable, calculated neutrality, and we haven't quite got onto that. I mean, this was neutrality of the kind the British demonstrated during the Irish famine and Switzerland during the Third Reich. It's that kind of neutrality. But no spectacular resignations from Her Majesty's Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
The Dutch government were changed as a consequence of
the Dutch government was changed, but having cocked it up so royally to the cost of 8,000 lives in eastern Bosnia. Perhaps a change of government. I'm sure the people who were left shamefully all went off to get very nice consultancies with oil companies.
But obviously the UN and our involvement, I'm sure you would criticise, maybe you will. But what should we have done? I mean, the assessment that we had no strategic interest, we may have had a moral one, but what do you believe, looking back 20 years later, we should have done?
I think it's obvious, and this isn't a prescription for Iraq, and I don't know if it's a prescription for Syria or not, and I'm unsure about Libya. But I mean, for me, in this case, there was absolutely no doubt. I mean, in 1995, NATO basically sacked the United Nations after 3 years of appeasement and dithering and worse. And they bombed. I mean, the Serbs get very excited about what happened, but I mean, they bombed a couple of wheelchairs and a garden shed, basically, and Karadzic and Mladic caved in immediately. I am convinced, and I'm not the only one. I mean, I've talked this through with people at the State Department over and over again. Not to mention people on the ground. I think that had they had NATO just sort of conducted moderate airstrikes against the gun emplacements over Sarajevo, around the what later became called the United Nations Protection Force, my emphasis, safe areas, my emphasis, again, of Srebrenica, Žepa, Česka, and what was the other one? Another one, Gorazde, of course. I think they would have capitulated. I mean, they were crap, these people. I mean, they weren't very good. I mean, they were good at rape, they were good at shelling women and kids in cellars. But I mean, and that was the other thing about the United Nations' failure. We, I think, as a community, as journalists, we were too enamored by the military. The Danish journalists had Danish soldiers to talk to. We had the Brits in Vitesse. But I don't remember actually sort of saying, hang on a minute, you're trying to tell me that you can't get from Sarajevo to Gorazde because there's a bunch of drunken Serbs in the road with an old garden gate saying, I'm sorry, turn around. Oh, sorry, carry on. I mean, it's pathetic.
Ed, I want to move you on to the Tribunal.
By the way, at the very end, what should we have done? Once the war turned, and wars tend to turn, Stalingrad, D-Day, it's what happens. This war turned too. One of the untold stories, or very little told, but what drives the diaspora and the fighters who went back to fight insane was that when they were on a roll and they were about to win the war, they were stopped by Richard Holbrooke, who has totally reinvented his role in this thing. And the fact that he's dead doesn't mean I've got to be polite about him. I mean, his memoir is one of the most extraordinary works of self-deception. So that's what should have happened. They should have been allowed to get on and win it. And then we would have one country, and the Serbs, I'm sure, would have been, if not welcome back, they would have come back, and the second half of this evening's discourse about what's happening now would not have to take place.
Can we talk about the Tribunal?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to open up to questions in 10 minutes. But
yeah.
Very much in support of your view on these things has been obviously the ITN libel trial, but also the Tribunal. Which can you talk about that and how it has, and what has it achieved in terms of helping us understand what really happened?
Right. And we must talk about the people before.
And also, we will talk about the people, and also, as a journalist, why did you testify?
Well, there's two things. I mean, we can go on all night about the ICTY, and we'll empty the room by 3/4, I should think, if we do. In a nutshell, it was an act of sort of ambition and contrition, the Tribunal. I mean, it was, the brave new world of justice, human rights, blah, 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 this better world a-coming that I think is an absolute fantasy, but anyway, it was part of that. That, had a legal brief, which was to try and either convict or acquit war criminals. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, to me, it was a no-brainer. I had no idea that it was going to be controversial to testify. When people, mostly in the United States, started saying, one chap actually said, as far as I'm concerned, you've renounced your right to call yourself a journalist after doing that. I mean, I don't know quite where they're coming from, although there is an argument. It says that journalists shouldn't testify because then they won't get stories, because war criminals won't talk to them because they know that they're going to bob up and meet you in court one day, which is what happened to me, surreally, up the ladder, actually. Kovacevic, Stakic, Karadzic, for those of you who know who those monsters are. But I would do it again tomorrow. The Tribunal, it became a great big fat tax-free, bonanza, just like everything else that the so-called international community touches. But some very, very good people were working there. Some very, very good people were prosecuting there. And I think it's perverse to suggest that these people are sort of better off free than in jail. Although I'd much rather they were in jail in sort of Texas or Alabama than watching porn movies in Sweden or whatever they do, playing tennis. Well, but on the other hand, it was an act of contrition, because the United Nations are so royally effed up, pardon me, during the war. They had to sort of do something in Holland to make up, and that's where the brief gets tricky, because its brief is also to promote reconciliation, and that's where the lie begins. That's what the book's about,
Well, I'm going to talk about that, but first I'm just going to sing your praises just for a little while, just to point out that what I would say myself about Ed's journalism is that so much of journalism is hearsay. It may be corroborated hearsay. I'm not saying it's poor, but the reason that Ed was called to The Hague so many times is because he was a witness as well as a journalist, and in a sense that's quite rare in journalism. So there we are. There's your plug. No, it's true. Can you talk about two things I want to talk about before I open it up? First of all, I want to talk about the survivors. Your book is about people. Can you talk a little bit about them? And then leave us time to talk about the quality of the piece a little bit.
Yeah. Well, let's try and do this within the 5 minutes, then, because we must have discussion. It's more interesting than listening to people babble on. The people, they're the core of this. Penny and I met people that day, August the 5th, 1992. They were not sort of cardboard cutout concentration camp prisoners. They were individuals who had worked in the steel industry or worked as security guards or worked as vets. And it was part intention, part pure coincidence. I mean, I did keep bumping into these people by pure, there's a man in there who said to Penny on film and to me, we were sitting at the table, the only person who dared to speak in Omarska, he said, I do not want to tell any lies, but I cannot tell the truth. The courage that remark took, and I think for many years one felt, just did that remark save or cost him his life? It turned out he walked into a room in 2004, I was at the meeting, I fell off my chair. There is, the famous Fikret Alic behind the bar.
What's he like?
Fence. Fikret, he's extraordinary. He had a very, very hard time. In 1993, I met him, and he referred back to that period as being, that's when I was talking always to trees. People wondered what kind of man wants trees for a friend. He's now an extraordinary sort of jester, the wise sage. And when I asked him, cheekily, it's not a question you should ask camp survivors really, how did you survive? He said, crucially, I survived because I am a man who laughs. And he has that very rare, crucial gift that people who survived the Holocaust as well as this have. It's the ability to sort of laugh with a hollow scowl at the absurdity of life and the meaninglessness of life, not just the atrocities that but it goes on and on. And I mean, I found the doctor, he has had the most extraordinary tribulations in Tribunal. He was trying to patch up. They would deliver the people they'd beaten and the girls they raped to a so-called medical centre, where this doctor and this lovely vet called Azra Blažević. And it's about their children, too. I mean, the extraordinary thing about this scattered, shattered community is that, they come back, they rebuild there. In this, the town I've studied most is, or have been to most, is called Kozarac. And they come back for the summer, most of them. Some went back to live. But there are these weddings between, you'll have a refugee's daughter in Zurich marrying a refugee's daughter in St. Louis, Missouri. So you have the village lives on across the planet. It's a very strange thing, and I wanted to stick with it, and sort of, so that was what was so interesting, really, was to just go around meeting these people over and over again, and especially last summer, on the frayed outskirts of Denmark, Germany, Utah, Manchester and London, indeed, because they're among us. It's about their lives among us.
Have any of them gone back?
Some have gone back to live, but not, I mean, a minority. Most.
And what's life like for them there?
There, well, I mean, we haven't talked much about Dayton or the
well, that's what I'm trying to get
Republika Srpska. For those who went around in 1995, understandably. Bosnia was partitioned. The Bosnian Serbs were given pretty much everything they wanted, a sort of Muslim-frei statelet. And by definition, those who wanted to try and go back had to fight all the way. Not only did they have to sort of drive trucks 724 around kind of Kansas, but they had to go back with the persecutors' stamp on their documents. And in the case of a place called Trnopolje, where there was a camp, they had to sort of physically face, physical opposition to go back. There's a wonderful story of the mother of a man who lives in Watford. She had a pretty threatening, menacing Serbian soldier living in the house. She went into the house, she slept on the sofa, and she stayed there for 4 years until he finally, she got him into the barn first and then out. This is what the book's about. I mean, 2/3 of it are these individual stories. Yeah.
The piece, the quality of the piece.
What piece?
Well, there is good news, isn't there? Surely, I mean, there's not
Yes.
been fighting for over 10 years, and
Yes, and of course.
aren't we inclined to be too critical of this? I mean, that's some success, surely.
Yes, well, I don't see that it can be ruled a success because it's arguably worse now than at any other time in the last 20 years in terms of what I call the reckoning. And the reckoning is a big word. For the perpetrator, it means coming to terms with what was done. It's a self-exposure. It's a confession. It's looking at yourself in the mirror. To use the obvious but extreme example, the creation of the easier fatherland of Germany. You know, between 1945 and 1965, Germany had achieved an enormous amount in terms of reckoning. I think it's not the Jews who are building the museums and the monuments, it's the Germans. Nothing comparable is happening in Bosnia. Again, I have to say this, I make no analogy between these two catastrophes, but the Holocaust Museum in Washington did allow me to use the word echoes, or in fact, echoes loud and clear, said the chairman of the Committee on Conscience. So I feel on fairly safe ground doing that. But I think the problem is that, and this is really what the book is about, the nub of it, is that, you know, if there is any hope, redemption, and we can talk about that in discussion, it comes from the extraordinary strength of will of individuals. Laughter, alcohol, family, love, music. It has nothing to do with the United Nations. It has nothing to do with the EU or any other bloody initials you care to give me, ICG, QPR, VAT, call them what you want. It has nothing to do with the diplomatic and political strata who basically have established themselves as parasites in a city, earning very nice tax-free salaries, thank you very much, and eating seafood on the coast with danger money. They have achieved absolutely nothing, and what the book is about, if it's about anything philosophically, although I don't call it that, this is the lie of reconciliation. The lie of the better world are coming, and it's, you know, and the so-called human rights movement is part of this as well. This fantasy that there's a dawn at the end of the thing. It's a religious thing, and that has achieved absolutely, in my view, I'm sorry, nothing. The achievement has been the remarkable achievement of the people where they've done it, and they haven't always made it. Some of them are much worse now than they were 10 years ago. In the Pebble Dash housing estates of Watford, Salt Lake City.
So it's all part of the sort of lost opportunity of the last 20, 30 years since the Berlin Wall fell down to promote liberal democracy and human rights. That's how you see it.
Yeah, well, I think those things are sort of, you know, they're things that, you know, sound great at conferences, but when you sit and talk to them after a few jars with the diaspora, they tend to be pretty unimpressed by all those concepts. I mean, the lie is progress. I mean, that's the biggest lie of all, but that's another conversation. But I mean, I think Bosnia has these problems, this lack of reckoning and everything. But what it also has, and I get reprimanded by this quite rightly by young Bosnian journalists and colleagues and friends, is you know, it is suffering from all the problems that, you know, any slag heap of postmodern global capitalism suffers from: drugs, unemployment, gun crime. All that is happening as it is anywhere else, in South Wales, Detroit, or wherever. I mean, you know, capitalism is kind of, well, whatever it is, whatever it's doing, is Bosnia's biggest problem. Actually, none of the things we're talking about, and yet it is exacerbated by this sort of fascistic ethno identity, which prevents and sort of perverts and retards any form of politics that enables young unemployed Serbs from feeling any much affinity from young unemployed Muslims, and also actually just even within the communities. I mean, football chants and football matches are always quite a good way of measuring things, especially in this country. You know, the behaviour of English fans abroad is a good way of measuring Britain, I always think, and in the aftermath of the war, No Žica Srebrenica was the great cry of the Serbian fans, knife and wire Srebrenica. No, that's not reckoning. But now, interestingly, you get sort of Zenica fans, who are mostly Bosniak Muslims, chanting about the Sarajevo massacre, marketplace massacre. You know, it's a sort of social implosion as well as a post-war dysfunction, if you like.
Surely some of the problems are the Bosnians' fault. It's not all the international community and the Serbs. I mean, is there not a certain tendency to expect the rest of the world to solve their problems, and a tendency to fail to demand a better life? I mean, they don't complain very much, do they? They just get on with it as if they're completely overburdened.
Well, they complain all the time about the wrong things. I mean, but then don't we all?
Well, you don't see many protesting, do you?
No. It's actually, that's a very interesting point.
I mean, the latest protest was when we were out there, which was
soldiers.
Who were united. There was Serb, Muslim, and Croats,
and of all ethnicities. Absolutely, very, very interesting indeed. And I think it's actually the most interesting thing that's happened in the last 20 years in many ways. But does anybody go down there and give them money, soup, cigarettes?
No, they just tut at them as they drive past on the tram.
Absolutely.
And this is the point, isn't, you know, surely the future of Bosnia is going to require Bosnians to build it.
Yes, it does. There's a kind of dependency. There's a dysfunction between the parasitic political and diplomatic international class and this kind of apparently immobile, ethno-obsessed politics. The C word, corruption. I get terribly wary of people in Britain who criticise other countries for being corrupt, because we've got the City of London and they don't. So no one is as corrupt as we are. But it's petty corruption. It's not laundering a third of the world's criminal money like we do.
But it's
acceptance. You don't need a gas station every 50 metres. You don't need an empty hotel with 1,000 rooms. Yet another one in some town that's only got 3.5 people living in it. And it's stultifying. Politics is stultifying.
I'm going to open it up because the most interesting part, I'm sure, is going to be the questions, and there are a lot of them.
Thank you.
So, can we start with that one there, please? Oh, it's gone. She's gone.
I ought to just, if I could, just finally as a code.
Yeah, okay.
I'm cheating here. But Bosnia, I've given a terribly dark impression. Bosnia is a way of life. We'll never die. Bosnia is a way of enjoying yourself, as a way of hospitality and love. I mean, that's with us forever, thank God. And the mountains and the rivers, they're pretty beautiful too. Sorry.
Mr. Villami.
Thank you.
It could be said that all wars have an economic basis, that the decay of the Serbian model of industrial started off with the rise of. If you go to Bosnia now, if you go to Serbia now, even Croatians living, it is economically in a state of collapse. Many of the people who live there are in a state of denial, especially in the Serbian part. What are your thoughts about that? This could yet spur a fresh conflict, a flashpoint to start it off, so to speak.
Well, thank you. I mean, you make 2 points. I mean, one is that there are aspects of this economic catastrophe you talk about which are common to all Eastern Europe. I mean, Eastern Europe was liberated, as we like to say in the West, from communism at a time when the kind of monetarist deindustrialization was at its most sort of fanatic zenith. I mean, had Latvia kept that electronics industry, they'd be in a very different country now. But so we sort of ravaged them in that way, and Bosnia's no different. I mean, you drive past empty factory after empty factory after empty factory. Had the Germans and the Swedes been giving them the economic guidance, they might have come to different conclusions. So there's that. As regards the war, and it's a related point, I can't see another war like that one, to be honest. But it's a fool that predicts, and I'm not. Well, maybe I am a fool, but I'm not going to predict. It's sort of, I can see it sort of degenerating into something differently nasty. Crime going into a sort of whirlwind of part ethnic, part drugs, part, I can just see it sort of degenerating, like parts of this country are degenerating fast, while the upper strata, of course, look after their own financial interests, as here, but with all these things exacerbated by these open wounds of war. I mean, on the other hand, it may take a small incident in a place like Srebrenica, the killing of some returnees or something, but you hear more hatred than you see. The physical violence, ako Bogda, hasn't happened yet, but it might. But I think it's going to be murkier, much closer to your economic point, actually, with much more in common with Bridgend, South Wales, Detroit, and the other sort of Ciudad Juarez maybe, and the other kind of capitalist slag heaps.
Next question.
I'm terribly interested, due to the richness of your English language and the way how you write, how you came across, because you launched the book in Sarajevo. How you came across? How do you come across all those people from Prijedor areas? Or how do you understand each other? Do you have chemistry with them? How was your launch in Sarajevo, basically? That's the simplest I can get.
Oh, sorry. Well, that was a completely social occasion. Nothing like this. It was extremely moving. We had about 80 to 100 people, 50 old soldiers, old hacks, with a few sort of comrades and renegades and alcoholics, and it was great. Speeches I couldn't understand, gifts that reduced me to tears, to be honest. I'm a very, very lucky man to know these people. And, they've enriched my life more than I have words to say, to be honest. But my greatest wish would be that I'd never met any of them, or that I'd met them by pure coincidence while on a train ride through Prijedor, and not the way I did. As regards
There's a question there.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. From following the Bosnian War in the 1990s, I followed on the news that the United Nations Security Council imposed an arms embargo on the former Yugoslavia, which affected Bosnia more than it affected Serbia. The argument was made that it affected Bosnia more than it affected Serbia or Croatia. So I was wondering what your opinion on that point was, whether you what your response to that is.
Yes. David Owen called it the level playing field, but the problem with the level playing field was that one side had the fourth largest army in Europe, whereas the other had a few hunting rifles and whatever the former serving soldiers could, sort of hide away in the cellar. So it's a bit like, sort of an old man like me is sort of in the ring against against a professional heavyweight boxer, and you sort of say, right, well now you've both got to take your gloves off, or rather, it was yet another variation on the theme, and thank you for bringing it up, because we were going to mention the other. It was yet another variation on the theme of, as I put it, appeasement at best, encouragement at worst, of the continuing mass murder. It was a way of making sure that it carried on until its logical conclusion, which was the creation of Republika Srpska, which is what I presume they wanted all along.
And it was enforced more by the British and French than the Americans.
Yes, well, the Americans were quite, they probably don't like to talk too much about this now, but there was a famous, Sarajevo may well have fallen had it not been the arrangement for a shipment of guns from Iran by the US ambassador to Zagreb, and the deal was that the Croats got half and the Bosnian Croats got half the half, so 25% of what the Bosnian government had paid Tehran for actually reached central Bosnia. But these little details, us kind of train spotters and stamp collectors like to talk about, but no, the Americans were strange in all this. Clinton was protean, he was one thing on a Monday, another on a Tuesday, but they were the best of a bad bunch.
Do you have that still question?
Hi, Ed. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about the importance of journalists returning to Bosnia, of course, but other areas as well.
Yeah. The opening line of the book is, unlike many war correspondents, I hate war. That's what I write. That's why I write about it. Vaughan was in the army. I'm coming at this very much from the sort of Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead end of the telescope, if you like it. I can't stand this stuff. I get scared. I hate it. And on the other hand, I have just sort of condemned myself to writing a book about the drug war in Mexico, which in some ways, though not in others, is more terrifying by a factor of 10, if not 100. And I did that because I think that's what the next century of warfare will look like. There is no sort of final whistle like at a football match on wars of empire in the 19th century. Damn it, we fought one in Iraq yesterday. Nor wars of ethnic eradication, which belong to the 20th century. These are still carrying on. But I think that what it's going to look like now is warfare on what I call the human slag heaps of capitalism, and that's Mexico. My friend Chuck Bowden, good man, has a formulation. Ciudad Juarez is not a breakdown of the social order. Ciudad Juarez is the new order. Well, that's Chuck with his inimitable blend of kind of whiskey and apocalypse. But
why
I think
are you
he's onto
talking about
something.
Mexico?
Because we were talking about returning to war.
Just
so in a way, I kind of said, and I think, sorry, I condemned. I'm trying to answer your question. I condemned myself to that. Never again. No way. I would not go to Afghanistan like Vaughan does. This is a great institution. But what was it somebody said to me at the Christmas party, a female who was going to come sing, I'd love to go. There's people I really would love to see, but I just can't take all those men talking about their erections on the front line. Excuse me, everybody, but I know what she means. So I'm not a war junkie, and I'm never going to do this again. As for people going back, I don't know why you do it. If you keep going back, you're going to get killed like Marie did. It's just statistics. It's chance.
thanks very much, and for lots of fascinating thoughts that you had. You talked, do I need to be closer? You talked about Germany, which, as you say, is very interesting. Clearly, they're not direct, but there are echoes there. And you talked about Germany confronting between 45 and 65. You could actually argue, and I'm interested in your sense of glasses being half full or half empty. Actually, I think Germany for 20 years actually had failed to confront, and the confrontation kind of began after 20 years. 68, there was a parents and children generation, and then the 10 and 20 years that followed. So I'm interested in terms of Bosnia's perspective. Do you see any signs that gradually, as those older ones who were either involved or saw or knew of terrible things going on, as they become the old and passing generation, does something new come through and a greater confrontation with truth? And if you don't feel that's happening organically, do you think there is, what is that can be done to help that process happen,
right,
which clearly dramatically helped Germany to move? You used the phrase earlier, the easier fatherland. The quote was the difficult fatherland. From 1968, when it had failed to confront, and in some senses that lack of full understanding by all sides, I think you'd probably agree, is one of the underlying difficulties.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's Steve Crawshaw, by the way, who's written sort of, the definitive book on that transition in Germany. And I think there are two things really. I mean, one is, and they go in opposite directions. I mean, one is there is no sign at the moment that the generation of Bosnian Serbs who were unborn or young at the time of the violence in their name have made overtures, or significant ones. On the other hand, there are some, and I think that is the hope. I mean, just as I don't see any redemption or reconciliation on any kind of meta macro political or philosophical level, I do see redemption in humour, family, love, music. I think that that the reckoning will come through people falling in love, rock and roll, just social intercourse, as these monsters die off. Not before time. I think that probably is the only hope, but it has to be, as Vaughan suggested, we've been talking about protest, it has to be sort of channeled through something that might be called, politics that relates to economic opportunity, politics that joins the dots as to who's ripping them off, domestically and internationally, politics that understands the way that they've been ravaged not only by war, but also by capitalism, something that, understands what they have in common. And also, we haven't talked about rape. Women are much better at this stuff than men, and I think it is that which has been achieved has generally been moved by women, not men. Certainly in the case of Srebrenica, for obvious reasons, all the men are dead. But I think if sort of mobilisations around rape are becoming quite interesting now. One of the great sort of almost parables of the peacekeeping effort by our great boys in the military and the police was that there was a scandal over trafficking of young girls from the Ukraine and elsewhere, not only for abuse by the soldiers and the police officers, but by the soldiers and the police officers, right up to the top of the United Nations and their American contractors. That created networks between women who had been abused in the war, Serb, Croat and Bosniak, which moved towards what you're talking about. But there isn't they weren't defeated, the Germans were defeated, and the Bosnian Serbs got what they wanted. And that's the crucial difference, possibly. I think you could also argue, I mean, you know more about German society than anybody in this room, but there are democratic and enlightened traditions in German society that one hopes prevailed. Thank you, Steve.
Another question over here.
Hi Ed, it's good to see you again. If we're wondering if you could just unpack for us, especially those of us who don't, who are quite young, some of your experiences and thoughts that you had in places that we don't really talk about enough, like Vača and Visegrad, Armici, Brčko, the rest of the places we haven't really mentioned tonight, and the places that we should mention, I think.
I'm hugely grateful for that question. Thank you. Because, we were in Sarajevo last week, and the red chairs, the river of blood, the little chairs, you crack up. But when Oslobođenje produced a wonderful supplement to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the siege, it didn't sort of seem to have, I think there was one page on the Drina Corps. I'm very, insistent on the fact that 90%, some 90% of the dead came from without Sarajevo. And those places that you mention, Foča, Visegrad, where civilians, mostly women and little children, were locked inside buildings and incinerated alive and slaughtered on the bridge, or half slaughtered on the bridge and sent downriver. Foča, where I think most of the rapes took place, along with Visegrad, and Moscow too. The rural reaches, and these were the places which, during the war, were the hardest to get to. With respect to those who stayed in Sarajevo, I mean, there was a reason for you to be in Sarajevo. You might get sniped at, but if you turned up in a place like Foča, you wouldn't live to tell the tale, probably. And I think we really must sort of, with respect to the great city of Sarajevo, we must widen this during this anniversary year to these places you're talking about. And also, you mentioned Ahmići. That, by the way, is the name of a place where some people were massacred in what I suppose one might call the sideshow war. The Bosnian Croats started off on a fairly sort of convincing, pale but convincing imitation of what the Bosnian Serbs had done in swathes of Herzegovina and central Bosnia. And to be fair, the Bosnian army allowed monstrous divisions of the Mujahideen into their ranks who committed atrocities against the Croats. So it's time to get into these rural reaches as well as to acknowledge what Sarajevo, the torture of the capital, because that's where most people were killed. And Sarajevo hardly features in this book at all, actually. It's all about the other places. Thanks.
Another question? One back, right at the back there.
I wanted to ask a question about what you think should be the future for Bosnia politically. When I was in Bosnia in 2006, I was talking to Schwartz Schilling, and he said he was going to be the last OHR head, and of course that's not the case. I thought Julian Borgia wrote an interesting piece in The Guardian this week, kind of summing up 20 years on, sort of saying, for example, and I'm using the OHR just in terms of the international aspect, he was saying that, if they leave, then, if the government could fall apart because there's no one there to kind of oversee it. But if the OHR continues to stay as they are now, the Bosnian members of government can blame the international community, blame the OHR for nothing going right. So I guess my question is, where do you see, I mean, obviously there's a conversation, getting rid of Dayton, blah, blah, blah. Where do you see it could go positively politically? I mean, this whole talk about like going towards EU integration, et cetera. But how can the country kind of move on politically?
Well, thanks. I mean, I have to say the term "move on" to me is one of those sort of, I don't really know what it means actually, because I mean, to me, the people that my book is about, I mean, they can't move on until something gives, until they are given back the history of what happened. That's the first thing. I mean, until that happens, there is no moving on. That's another of these political. Not you. I mean, you're paraphrasing somebody else, but that's another of these buzzwords the politicians and the diplomats and the human rights people and the left and the right and everybody uses. And I think it's a lie. But again, I don't want to make this too general. But the OHR and the internationals stay on because it's in their financial interests to stay on. I mean, whoa! I mean, if you've been there for 10 years, you're on big. You've got a nice big fat bank account, and it's not just me talking about that. When you're with refugees or you're with the witnesses at The Hague, they're often in The Hague. They're not even talking about the atrocities. They want to know how much the lawyers are earning, because that's how refugees think. That's how very poor people think. And the refusal of these clowns to disclose their salaries speaks much more to the poor and the refugees in Bosnia than it does to us in this room. They're a disgrace. They're despicable. There are good ones among them, but they won't disclose how much they earn. And they need to tell people how much they earn. That's the first thing. Then there's this assumption that the political parties can solve these situations. Well, I mean, let's not go too general, but I don't think political parties can solve any effing situation. this country or any other. And I'm not sure this great feared collapse of the Bosnian political system. I mean, great. What could be better than for this sort of retarded, ethno-defined mafia political system to collapse? I mean, out of the collapse, you might even get something that Steve and I were sort of working towards in terms of, some autogestion, some kind of sense of some self-confidence that the Greeks are starting to have now that their political system has collapsed. I mean, I'm not against political systems collapsing, but let's not go too far down that road.
There's a question here.
Sorry, I mean, I sound much more convinced of that than I sound more convinced of that than I am. One of the problems with our society is we have all these newspaper columnists and journalists and politicians banging on as if they're so sure of what they think. I'm not. Usually they pretend to be sure of what they think, and they pretend they know what they're talking about, which they don't. This time I kind of do know what I'm talking about, but I'm not sure. But I think, after 20 years of failure by the international parasites and this retarded political system, I don't see that collapse is such a bad idea.
I guess I should speak as a parasite, because I served with the United Nations in '94 and with NATO in '96. And I can tell you that all of us who were there were trying to make the best of a bad situation. I think I would also argue that Bosnia happened because there was a political collapse in the communist system. So the chaos that created, I find it a bit odd that you would say that you're hoping for a kind of a political collapse. I think it's perfectly true to say that the situation that is there now, and I speak of someone who's not been back since '96, is far from ideal. But at least if you compare where things were 96, 97, 98, compared to where it was 92, 94, at least the mass slaughter wasn't happening. So did the international community's efforts contribute to stopping that mass slaughter? I would say arguably we certainly did. We perhaps could have acted earlier, we could have perhaps acted differently, we could perhaps had a better solution than Dayton was, no doubt about that whatsoever. But I think you're being just a little bit too strong in attacking the efforts that people like myself and colleagues that I was with out there did to try to make the best of a very, very difficult situation. And that while it's not where we would perhaps want it to have got to, at least the mass slaughters did stop. I think perhaps some of the lessons that were taken about that were applied very wrongly in Iraq later on and in other places. So if you talk about the lessons of Bosnia, perhaps we learned some of the lessons of, the success of liberal interventionism in kind of inverted commas can lead to nirvana. That, of course, was never the case, and we perhaps misconstrued it. But I think you're just being a little bit too harsh on the efforts of the international community. Most of the people that I know who have served there, and some who still are there, are not doing it for the money. And there's an awful lot of well-meaning people who perhaps sometimes have done the wrong things through well-meaning ways, and it's true to say perhaps the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But I think just being a bit harsh on the efforts of the international community.
Okay, well, certainly I don't know who you are, but I exempt you straight away because you're here. And the fact that you're here speaks volumes. And sorry, I said to the lady I wasn't sure about the collapse, and I agree with you about the collapse. Although, if the three main nationalist parties were kind of to implode following the departure of the international community, I don't think that would badly damage Bosnian society, to be honest. And with regard to the point about where we are further down the road, I mean, you haven't been there since 1996, so you can't have made that much money. And if you had, you wouldn't be here. And I salute you, sir, for coming. And thank you for coming. But I think 20 years and the kind of money that has been spent there over the 20 years. There have been moments. I mean, Paddy Ashton did, just suddenly sort of face down 90, police officers that shouldn't have been serving police officers, and he sacked them. But it is strange, just no names, and I'm on splinters a little here. it's a bit weird to be getting sort of hot tips from inside the international stratum about problems with returnees in Bielino. Perhaps you'd like to do a story. It might put. Well, why don't, Penny Ashton also said to me, "I've got this terrifying power." Well, if you've got terrifying power, then I'm sorry, Mr. Mittal. Omarska belongs to the survivors. They have their monument. I'm sorry, Mr. Bielino, who in some litigation about whether or not returnees should pay for improvements. Well, I'm sorry. No, they don't have to. I mean, 20 years is a long time. But can I, without even knowing who you are, exempt you from any disdain?
All criticism.
Right, as someone who's worked for the international community, I dare to differ actually, because my experiences of having worked for OSCE for 2 years in Bosnia and Mostar, which is where I come from originally, is that most people are there for the money, and do you not feel that the international community are just prolonging the agony and just basically trying to maintain the status quo, meaning the data, and also not addressing the the question of the others. I mean, the issue of the others, those who do not fall into 3 categories of Bosniak, Serb or Croat.
Who did you work for the OSCE?
OSCE,
in
yes.
Mostar.
In Mostar.
Well, you know more about it than I do.
Nobody seems to know anything about Herzegovina, actually.
No. But I mean, I sit and listen to. Now I'm starting girding my loins slightly. So, but you left in '96. I mean, I spent a lot of time listening to people in Sarajevo, Banja Luka, and Mostar talking about just the way they're treated. You get some sort of not very well qualified police officer or something telling someone with an engineering degree to how many sugars they want in their tea. These things matter. I mean, there's a lot of sort of macro talk going on tonight. This book is vernacular stories for the most part. I think these vernacular stories matter a great deal. I really do. It wasn't happening in '96, but I mean that trafficking story and the fact that it was covered up by the UN to the top speaks volumes to me. And we haven't talked enough about the sexualization of the violence in Bosnia. Sorry, you're saying that they are there for the money. You're saying that they are there for the money, or they're not?
Yeah, she says they are.
They are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think too many of them
they are there for the money. Most of them, I mean, I have met some amazing people who really do care.
Absolutely.
And who are just absolutely inspiring, and they actually seem to care more than the local people do. But they are in a minority.
That's beyond doubt. It's like I said the same thing about The Hague, and I would say it about. I mean, The Hague has some of the best people I've met in this whole 20 years who never went there in the war, but they're prosecuting in The Hague, and boy, do they care. And I'm sure the same is true of the international organization. But
Ed, does this all come from the original sin of applying this moral equivocation that we all went in for, the West went in for, where we originally said they're all as bad as each other? Is this where this all comes from, do you think? This sort of Western failure?
I think so. Well, yes, again, I mean, I sort of echo what the gentleman said. Former Yugoslavia does have some role in this as well. They did start killing each other. And raping and on a spectacular scale. But I think internationally, since we're talking much more about diplomacy than I would like to, and there's not much of it in the book, that was the original problem.
And it all came from that, didn't it? That the manner in which the West intervened and continued its intervention, and the criticisms that you've made and the ladies there.
And again, I prefer vernacular to metatosh, to be honest. I mean, little things. I'm convinced that the British Foreign Service likes to deal with a proper embassy, with proper chandeliers, not some windy corridor in Sarajevo with sort of some jumped up Muslim politician who hasn't been able to wash his shirt for a month. Yeah. They don't like these people. Soldiers like to deal with other soldiers with lots of scrambled egg. I mean, the chemistry between Mladic and the generals was crucial. I think this stuff matters because I think deep down these are quite mediocre people.
We've got another one from over there.
Yeah, this follows up a bit on the last question, but in relation to the ICTY. You've spoken a bit about it, and you referred to some of the very good people who are there. And you've also referred to some of the people who are there for the DSR and the tax-free salaries. I would be interested to know what value you believe the ICTY has had in relation to this region?
Oh, enormous value. I mean, you know, it has secured the arrest of, tried, and convicted, mostly convicted, some of the worst war criminals in Europe since the Third Reich. I mean, how bad can that be? And you know, all credit to them. I mean, it was whatever the reasons of contrition, whatever the, as it were, the sort of offset for the failures on the ground for it being set up. I don't think anyone thought Karadzic was going to be there and Mladic. You know, I didn't actually. And that is an achievement, however much it's cost and however much they've earned. You know, there are stories, one could go on and on about how much the defence lawyers get out of this. I mean, you know, there's now a burgeoning industry. There's one British barrister who goes around earning about 100 grand a month defending all sorts of murderers and slaughterers all over the world. You know, there is all that. But at the end of the day, you know, better, surely, you know, the judicial achievement has been estimable. For me, there's no argument about that. And I'm happy to have played a part in that if I have. As regards its wider remit of promoting reconciliation, that's a weird thing for a court of law to set itself the task of doing. I mean, there we get back to this thing. I mean, you know, it's round and round. You can't have reconciliation without reckoning, and reckoning is this sort of shattering of the lies and the myths and the ice and the revisionism, and it's the sort of rolling up your sleeves and putting it in the bucket of shity, and you know, and that hasn't happened. And I don't see how you know, it so happens, by the way, that the woman who is charged with taking that sort of strange extra legal brief from the court onto the ground when the ICT wraps up is an extraordinary woman from Visegrad, and if anyone's going to be able to do it, it's going to be her. She wants to shout it from the rooftop, she said, and she will. But it's a strange thing for them to do. But judicially, I don't know. Who's complaining?
Next question. We've got a question here, yes, sorry.
Hello. Hello. First, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for
and
coming.
I agree with 90% of what you said.
Well, let's have the 10%.
I was not in Bosnia during the war, but I was in Omarska and Kazaric last year, and I met some remarkable, brave and wonderful people. And I'd like to recommend to anybody that hasn't read Ed's book, Seasons in Hell, to read it. And my question is about the people that lost their homes in what is now Republika Srpska and all that sort of thing. Can you tell us some personal stories about their feelings after Dayton, which maybe stopped the war but split communities down ethnic lines? Stories that you've heard in the diaspora and friends that you know about what they think about going back.
The return,
yes.
as it's called, is a hugely varied and you know, there are as many stories as there are people, as in any sort of, you know, there's another lie, post-conflict resolution. My book is about post-conflict irresolution. And one of the first experiences of the irresolution was the attempt of these people to go back. There have been some strong returns. Kozarats, another place called Kozluk in the Drina Valley, which are very well organised, well led. And there's some stories which don't quite fit the sort of the lovely goody and baddie thing. When they first started going back to Kozarats, it was touch and go in terms of their safety. And one time a Serbian guy came around and tried to knock the guy around. He just come back from Norway. One of the first. He shot him just to make it clear that they were serious about this. I mean, the lady sleeping on the sofa and driving the man out just by her stubbornness is a wonderful story. My last glimpse of her last year was striding across her meadow with an axe to go and cut wood, having festered in Watford too long. But then on the other hand, the return around Srebrenica is a different story. Very little to the town itself, quite a bit in the surroundings, but at a place called Glogova, a couple I talked to went back and woke up next morning to find their cow flayed on the doorstep. It's been incredibly hard, and it's economically very vulnerable too. I must be careful legally what I say here. The Mittal Steel Company has, it says, got a sort of a equal opportunities program, but the fact is that the reopened mine on the site of Omarska, where there is no monument to the dead, it does not employ more than very, very few Bosniak returnees. there are mines in eastern Bosnia, silver and zinc mines that employ no Bosnian returnees. And that gets us back to the economic sort of perversions, if you like. Well, there are so many stories. They work and they work. There's one quite funny line. If you'll forgive me, there's a guy who drove a truck for years to build his house and a cafe back, and he said, it's easier to get money for a mosque, he said, because the Arabs will pay anything to build mosques all over the place. It's just much harder to get money for your house. He said, I quite like the mosques. I don't go myself to pray much, but I like the minarets because they're all a middle finger stuck up to the guys who did that. Anyone religious here, forgive me, it's a joke. Good one, I think.
Well, I just
afterwards I'll tell you some more if you like. Sorry, man.
That's all right. I just wanted to add to this point about the return of refugees. That's actually where the Dayton Agreement and the Office of High Representative have failed the most, because the Annex 7 of the Dayton Agreement was never quite implemented. Therefore, the OHR office has failed to fulfill their duty, which was to overlook the implementation of Dayton Peace Accord, which perhaps wouldn't have been in such a bad state, or wouldn't have brought the Bosnia in such a bad and sort of paralyzed state right now if it had been fully implemented, which Annex 7 was supposed to guarantee the return of the refugees, which would have obviously given equal rights to the Bosnian people obtaining back or getting back their homes and being able to vote in Republika Srpska, therefore having enough of the MPs in the parliament who wouldn't always give this easy option for the Serbs from Banja Luka to veto anything that is good for Bosnia, or anything that would ensure the Bosnian progress towards the European Union. And at the same time, perhaps a simple apology or acknowledgement of the Srebrenica genocide from the Banja Luka would have been welcoming, and maybe that would help the reconciliation between the people. You spoke earlier on about how the normal people, on the social scale, they would try to get on well and try to coexist again. Those who obviously felt the pain on personally, who have suffered, can easier forget and they can easier forgive. But on the political scale, until the international community, who have failed Bosnia on so many levels, firstly, we spoke of the arms embargo, which prevented Bosnia to defend themselves at the time. We didn't require the international community to send in their soldiers. Very much grateful, of course, for those who have come to help. But at the time, had we not had the arms embargo imposed, we wouldn't have needed the international community to intervene in that sense. But having failed that and having imposed on us the Dayton Peace Accord, which gratefully have stopped the killing, but has paralyzed the state now, and it's been 20 years, and there has been no progress. What we do have at the moment is the international community again hammering down and now encouraging, or perhaps failing to punish the rhetoric that is currently going on in Bosnia, or coming better said from the Republika Srpska, of the secession of Republika Srpska. Sorry. Question. Yeah. I don't need a question. I'm just exactly. Thank you.
Important points.
So I'm just stating few points, trying to clarify for people who have little understanding of what's going on. So this is what we need from the international community: is actually to intervene more and to come up with a solution and change the Dayton Accord and empower or allow the High Representative to impose his powers and punish those who are stopping the progress of Bosnia towards the European Union and the integration.
We might just go on to another question as well, and you can deal with both at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you for that. We'll address that.
No, I will. Both the return and the question of the arms embargo.
We do have a question over there, did we?
Yeah. Well, we all know that no path of reconciliation is ever easy, and reconciliation is about accepting about what happened and trying to move on. Don't you think the reckoning that you speak of should be about the success of moving on rather than using the bad experiences of what people had in hindering the progress moving forward?
Right, thank you. Excellent questions, both. Now, the first one, the question of the return, it's absolutely crucial because and they're related, these two. The failure to protect the return. There is a caveat, by the way. I mean, Ashdown did a hell of a lot with a guy called Charlie Elliott for the return in Srebrenica. But Srebrenica has become a case apart. Srebrenica is one of those places which is supposed to sort of, I would hope, draw attention to the others, but it's actually had the opposite effect. It's distracted attention. It's a place where, with a caveat of that, of the encouragement and protection of that return to perhaps one of the hardest places around Bratunac. The failure has been to protect and secure the return has been, I agree, culpable, but it's been incredibly important with regard to what your young lady at the back talked about the reckoning. Because if you, as you know, the people in the book have done, if you just work and work and work, and everything you have achieved in building this house with the crossed S's on your every document you have, is despite not because of the international community, despite not because, for sure, the Republika Srpska, who make it almost impossible, they still do. Penny and I were talking to a motel owner, and they make it impossible for him to run his business because he's a returnee Bosnian. They don't want this motel, they want him to go bankrupt, and he will. It's all despite, not because. This creates an energy, this creates friction, this creates an edge. This is the opposite of reckoning. And to answer your question, madam, I mean, absolutely, of course. It's, again, this term "move on." You have to proceed through time because time's going to pass whatever you do or don't do. But there are these preconditions, and there are elements of pride in this. There are elements of the fact that on the individual level, if somebody, as a friend of mine has, as you say, he's built his house, he's trying to build his mother's house, he's done it, and then two things suddenly happen. Actually, these are two people composited into one. On the one hand, his brother suddenly wakes up one morning, flips, talking about the camps. He does nothing else. He wakes up, talks about the camps, having been okay for 15 years, apparently, and is now in a mental hospital, schizophrenic, and his mother now can't go back to the rebuilt house because she's got to be in Denmark to look after him in the mental hospital. So the return is messed up because it turns out you may think you're moving on, and you suddenly crash, you collapse. And I think this not being given back the history is part of this. It's not, obviously, it doesn't explain all this, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but many, survivors of the Holocaust are always inside the camps. They never leave. And some of them go back further inside the camps the older they get. This is a lexicon that only the survivors know about, that the psychiatrists can try and the historians can try, but we don't really know what's in where they are, these people. But a part of that is this giving you back the history, to have fulfilled those obligations that the lady was talking about, to help the return, would have been a very important move on the way. There are a couple of other things, if I can just mention them in reply to you. Two things which are utterly germinal, totally primal. We've been doing it since we stood up on the plains of Kenya and started walking. Giving the dead back to the living for burial, and the commemoration, building stones where the dead were killed. I mean, this is the stuff of myth. It's the stuff of everything. It's who we are with all our faults as the human race. These things are being impeded too, unbelievably. There are 1,000 people still in the ground, missing, in the area around Prijedor, which is the book's concerned with, alone. After 20 years, that's a lot of people. People are intimidated for taking the people they're called the ICMP and their affiliates. I mean, a wonderful job of identifying the dead, giving them back to the living for burial. That's being impeded. There is no monument at Omaska. Where else in the world could you have had a camp with that kind of violence? And the multinational corporation, well, I've got to be careful legally here. What it has done is it has abdicated its responsibility in the view of everybody to make sure that there is a memorial. These things make it really hard on the individual level to, as you put it, move on.
One final question, please, from the back. Very last question from the back.
I just wanted to comment on the reference about the international community providing intervention in Bosnia now, and just to say where I'm coming from. I've spent over 8 years in Bosnia during the war and afterwards with the military and as a volunteer, so don't accuse me of profiteering. No. And I visit every year. I go back on my motorbike and visit friends. I stay there. I consider it my second home, in all honesty. But we've mentioned many times this evening the fact that it's 20 years since the war. OHR, I believe, has 8 international staff. Local MPs who are elected from 3 nationalist parties who pretty much started the conflict have now formed an alliance. They work together. They voted themselves €10,000 a month wages, when most people are lucky to get 300 if they have a job. And I think, with all due respect to all the Bosnians in the room, many whom are my friends, I think the time to look for the international community to solve the problems is over. It's like Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, if we intervene, we're criticized. If we don't intervene, we're criticized. 20 years on, and this goes back to the point you made initially at the beginning of the program here, the lack of protest in Bosnia amazes me as well. I have conversations with my friends, not arguments, but very insightful conversations. Why don't they go to the streets? Why don't they protest when the MPs and the politicians are obviously so corrupt and making so much money? And I think, whether you agree or not, the reality is the international community is not going to intervene or help any further.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here, but I'd like to, in my final comments, obviously thank you, Ed, for coming here.
Thank you.
We're very grateful to hear from you.
Thank you all for coming.
And thank you all for coming. But I'm going to give him one final plug for the book, this wonderful book, which I've read and found extremely helpful. In some way, we talk about missing monuments, and I think that's where we sort of ended up in this conversation. And I think Ed's book goes as far as any book I've read can into achieving that, and so it's certainly going on my shelf, and I hope it'll go on yours too. Thank you very much. How much? He gave it to me. Mine's free.